I am Grace Gedye. I work at Consumer Reports on consumer protection issues in AI policy. And for the past couple of years, I've spent the majority of my time focused on state-level AI legislation and regulation in the US. So in practice, that means I review a lot of bills and figure out whether or not they effectively protect consumers. I talk to legislators. I figure out whether or not my organization can officially support a bill. And I've testified in a lot of states, including Texas, Maryland, Connecticut, New Mexico, and advised on bills in those states, along with California, Colorado, Virginia, New York, Minnesota, Vermont, Massachusetts, and I've served on Colorado's legislature's task force. I'll hand it to Cody.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Cody Venzke. I'm a senior policy counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union. We're a nonprofit in the United States focused on protecting civil rights and civil liberties. My focus is usually on federal technology policy, but given the political climate that we're going to be diving into today, I spent a lot of time assisting our state affiliates in drafting legislation focused on data privacy and regulation of artificial intelligence.
Hi everyone, I'm Kara Williams. I'm a law fellow at the Electronic Privacy Information Center, or EPIC. We are an independent nonprofit in Washington, D.C., and we are focused on obtaining the fundamental right to privacy in the digital age. Personally, I focus on state policy, both privacy and AI, so just like Grace and Cody, that means I do a lot of bill review and have worked with and traveled to many states across the country to advise legislators on these topics.
So also, y'all, how is the mic level? Can you hear well? Okay, great. So we'd love to get a sense of who is in the room by a show of hands. So if you think of yourself as someone who works on AI policy or follows it closely, raise your hand. Okay. And keep your hand raised if you specifically follow US state-level AI policy. Okay, a few, okay. And then raise your hand if you're a researcher who doesn't follow policy closely. Okay. And then raise your hand if you feel like you've got a good understanding of the structure of the US government and what states versus the federal government does. Okay, super helpful, thank you. Okay, so just to give you a sense of where we're going today, we're gonna do a quick overview of the goals. We're gonna quickly orient you to the role that US states play in the policymaking process versus the federal government. We're gonna talk about some recent trends we've seen at the state level in terms of AI policy, and kind of which areas are getting the most attention from state legislators. And then we're going to zoom in on 6 examples of specific pieces of legislation to kind of give you a more fine-grained view of how states are approaching some of these issues. And then we're going to talk about the state policy making process and how it works on paper and how it works in actuality, how the sausage gets made, how lobbyists influence the process, et cetera. And then we're going to explain how people with technical expertise can get involved. And this is really key because I suspect there are people in the audience right now who have expertise that could help make state-level AI policymaking better. And that's the big reason that we want to present at FACT. We're going to take some questions at the end. So if you have questions, keep them in your mind, write them down. We would love to answer them. Okay, so key takeaways for today. First, at this moment in US history, states are the key movers on AI policy. There are all sorts of barriers to passing new law at the federal level in Congress, but states are moving quickly. 2, state legislators by and large are not AI experts and they are under-resourced. This, of course, varies, and there are some state legislators who have technical backgrounds, but that is atypical. In a lot of states, being a legislator is a part-time job. Their other jobs might be running a small business, being a lawyer. In some cases, they have no staff personally to work with them, which means they're having to learn a lot quickly, and the experts and lobbyists who come to them directly are largely informing their understanding of the issue and potential solutions. And 3, in the absence of civil society and expert involvement, legislators are swayed by lobbyists for tech companies. We've each seen this personally again and again, getting emails from legislators saying, Google came to my office the other day and they told me this part of the bill wouldn't work, that it would break the internet. Like, is that true? Happens all the time. And these are some state capitals that have been active on AI recently: Colorado, New Mexico, Albany, and California. Okay, and the goals for today are kind of pretty simple: understanding how US states are advancing AI policy, how it impacts you, and how you can get involved. And we do really mean get involved, not in a theoretical way, in a very practical way. So this is an example of Professor Suresh, who gave the first keynote. He came to testify on a Maryland bill that dealt with automated decision-making systems and bias. Kara and I were working on that bill as well, and he was informing a panel of state legislators about how bias gets into algorithmic systems. And experts play a really important role, especially in offering technical explanations of AI-driven harms and also how they can be mitigated. And they play a really crucial role in adding nuance or rebutting kind of sweeping and overbroad claims made by tech lobbyists. Okay, so why are we even talking about state policymaking, right? Isn't Congress the body that does the important legislative work for the country? Well, if you follow US politics at all, you probably know that Congress is quite broken. There are all sorts of political and institutional reasons why Congress now struggles to pass legislation outside of budget bills where there's an imminent crisis. And that's kind of illustrated by this chart here. In 2023, Congress passed the fewest bills it had in decades. And one area where Congress has especially struggled to keep up is tech policy and consumer protections in tech policy. And kind of a good example of this is the US approach to privacy legislation. So Congress started talking about the need for federal privacy legislation in 1999, before there were smartphones. The internet was still quite nascent. Does anyone know when Congress passed a consumer data privacy law? You can just shout it out if you know. Okay, well, as many of you know, we still haven't. We've been talking about it for more than 25 years. We still have not done it. And it's not because Congress hasn't made any attempts. There have been lots of bills, a lot of bills that my colleagues have worked quite hard on to improve, and they just cannot pass the law. So the takeaway is we should not be holding our breath for Congress. You would die. But in the meantime, states have acted. So 19 states have passed consumer data privacy laws. And this is kind of the same dynamic we're seeing with AI as well. Congress is not expected to pass a nuanced package of legislation that kind of deals with the variety of AI harms. And so states are leading the way as well. Okay, so in 2024, because the 25th session is still ongoing, in 2024, raise your hand if you think states considered somewhere between 0 to 50 bills. And by considered, I mean like introduced. On AI. Oh, sorry, on AI specifically. Yes, we missed that crucial word. Okay, not seeing any hands. Okay, one hand, okay. Raise your hand if you think it was between 50 to 500. Okay, good share of the room. Raise your hand if you think it was greater than 500. Okay, a few hands. It was 700 or more. That's just the best estimate that we have. So yes, in 2024 alone, state legislators across the country introduced approximately 700 pieces of AI-related legislation. And the vast majority of those bills don't pass, but some do. So this is just to illustrate, states are moving, they're not waiting. When you hear AI policy has stalled in the US, tell the person you're hearing that from, states are actually doing things. And in our conversations with legislators, something I've heard a number of times is that policymakers feel like they kind of miss the boat on other tech harms, especially harms stemming from social media. They feel like policymakers were too slow to respond, and they don't want to make the same mistake again with AI. So why should you care? If you work for a global tech company, a US state that you don't think about that often could really impact how you do business in the US and how you reach US customers. If Rhode Island passes a law, you have to comply with that to reach people in Rhode Island. If you work on tech policy in a non-US country, it's important to follow because states can kind of create a de facto national standards. US states often copy each other. That's kind of what has happened with data privacy laws. Some companies will choose to comply with a state that set the highest bar nationally. Okay, gonna hand over to Cody.
Excellent. So before we turn to what states have been doing, we're going to dabble a little bit on the structure of United States government and what role states play in that greater structure. So the critical thing here is that the United States is a federated system, meaning that the states are their own separate sovereigns, that they are not simply subdivisions of the national government. And consequently, there are apportioned powers between the national government based in Washington, D.C., and the state governments based then throughout the rest of the country. In the United States Constitution, the federal government has a few what we call enumerated powers, the theory being that the federal government can only legislate on certain areas. I've listed a few of them here, but for our purposes, the real key one is interstate commerce. Any type of economic activity that crosses state borders or crosses international borders generally falls under the purview of the federal government. States then have powers to do anything that's not explicitly denied to them in the US Constitution. So they have very broad authority, and consequently that means they often have overlapping authority with the federal government. And we're going to talk in a moment about what happens when the federal government and the state government can both claim authority to regulate in a specific area. In this way, the United States is similar to other federated systems like Germany, Canada, and India, again, emphasizing these aren't subdivisions of the national government, but separate sovereigns, and consequently, there's opportunity for cooperation and conflict. And when that conflict happens, the power defaults to the federal government. And this happens under a clause in the United States Constitution called the Supremacy Clause, which I've quoted here, and we don't need to dive into the exact quote, but it basically says, if the United States Congress has authority to pass legislation on a certain topic, if they so choose, they can preempt states in that space. Preemption just means to displace, to make the state laws null and void. And this has been an issue that Congress has explored in a number of areas, but especially in tech policy. It's bedeviled privacy law, for example, for years at the federal level, and is one of the primary reasons we don't have a federal privacy law in the United States. But it's quickly becoming a key issue in AI policy in the United States as well. But what has the federal government done on AI policy? Well, they've done a few things, largely exploratory in nature. During the pandemic, they passed a handful of pieces of legislation, one being the AI in Government Act of 2020, as well as the Advancing American AI Act. These bills did a number of things, but for our purposes here, they largely looked inward to the federal government and provided some frameworks for the federal government to regulate its own use of artificial intelligence. They established a use case inventory for federal agencies to have to publicize what AI they were using. It required an agency within the United States government known as the Office of Management and Budget to provide guidance for federal agencies to audit and evaluate AI if they think it might impact people's rights. And they created pilot programs in a handful of agencies for those agencies to explore ways that AI might make the government more efficient. Over in Congress, down the road in Pennsylvania Avenue, the House and the Senate both have done a lot of exploring. The House had an AI task force that released a 200-page report last Congress, and the Senate conducted a number of insight fora with our conversations with the tech industry, civil society, and others to explore different topics around artificial intelligence. So far, those exploratory efforts haven't uncovered much. There is still no comprehensive AI bill pending in the United States Congress, so we're waiting to see what Congress does substantively. But it hasn't stopped Congress from also looking at its preemptive authority. As I mentioned, preemption is the ability of the federal government to tell states you can't regulate here anymore. And despite the fact that there is not a federal AI bill on the table, the United States Congress is actively considering preempting the state laws that we're going to be talking about today. This is happening in a budget package known as reconciliation, and it's called a moratorium, but it would keep states from regulating artificial intelligence for 10 years. Those discussions are actively happening in Congress right now. We're expecting some news on whether that is going to move, even right now. So it's definitely a space to watch. But once again, preemption and the idea that the federal government is the one to take the reins over AI policy continues to be a key issue for the United States. But moving from the federal government down to the state governments, we briefly want to talk about how state governments are structured. And state governments, like the United States federal government, are split between three separate branches. You have the head of state, the executive, that is situated in the governor's office, a legislature that has the ability to pass new laws, and that legislature is often divided between a Senate that has longer terms and tends to represent more people, and a General Assembly or a House that has shorter terms and is designed to be more responsive to popular will. In addition to those two political branches, the executive, governor, and the legislature, there's also a judiciary that's independent from either of those two branches. As we explore the different laws that states have passed, it's important to take a moment to think about what different rulemaking authorities states might have. The first and primary one, of course, is the ability of the legislature to pass new laws. And this is really the fundamental starting point for any type of regulation. If you want to establish new rules around the duties of private parties or their obligations, like whether or not an AI company should audit their algorithms for civil rights impacts, it's probably going to require new legislation to establish those new responsibilities. But once legislation has been passed, a number of other entities have responsibilities to implement them. Governors, for example, can issue executive orders directing the executive branch to carry out laws in specific ways. And we've seen some governors use this to tell agencies, when you're procuring AI, here are the steps you need to take. In addition to that, agencies within the executive branch, like a Department of Commerce or a Department of Education, can issue regulations. These are legally binding rules that are often done with public input that can also shape policy. But the key aspect here is these agency rules have to stay within the lanes that are drawn by the legislator through new legislation. And the last rulemaking authority is agency guidance. These are technically not legally binding, but agencies will sometimes issue best practices or suggestions of how they might interpret a law in an enforcement proceeding. We're going to focus today on that first bucket, legislation. What can you do to influence state legislators as they shape those new rules? Because that is really becoming the forefront of AI policy in the United States. And with that,
so let's talk about what we are seeing at the state level. Let me just get these all up here. So 3 categories of legislation we're seeing in a lot of states are: the first is task force bills. These are bills that create some sort of task force, often to study AI and make recommendations to the legislature. In 2024, 35 of these bills were introduced, 8 passed. This is often the first step a legislature takes. Task forces can be a good opportunity to bring diverse perspectives to the table, but one issue we've seen is that sometimes task forces are very one-sided and are kind of packed with representatives of various industries, but have no representatives of consumers or workers, people who defend civil rights, et cetera. In 2024, we saw 40 bills introduced that related to the state government's own use of AI and regulating that, 12 of which were signed into law. This is another step we often see states take first before doing private sector regulations, because it's often politically easier for states to put rules on themselves. But, if it sets high standards for the technology that the state government will buy, those standards can influence industry and can often inform private sector regulation as well. And then in 2025, we saw 18 bills that took on bias and transparency in automated decision-making systems in the private sector in a very similar way. These 18 bills looked very, very similar, and that was largely the product of state legislators working together across state lines in weekly Zoom calls, swapping messages on Signal, et cetera, and copying one another. In 2025, none of these bills have been signed, but they largely mimic a bill that was passed in 2024 in Colorado, which we will talk about more. And these bills aren't the only approach we've seen states take to bias and discrimination in automated decision systems. Other approaches we've seen, is states issuing guidance about how existing civil rights legislation applies to algorithmic systems, or sector-specific bills, like bills that deal just with the use of AI and automated systems in hiring and employment. 2 more areas we've seen a lot of activity. One is the use of deepfakes in campaigns and elections, and the other is non-consensual intimate image deepfakes. These bills have passed really rapidly, sometimes unanimously, which is pretty uncommon. And for anyone who's super interested in what's happening at the state level on deepfake legislation, I recommend going to Public Citizen's website. They have trackers on each subject, which is what I'm showing here. Okay, so let's talk through some examples. We're going to offer some examples from each of these states, but again, these are not the only bills that have passed, just somewhat representative.
So we're going to go ahead and start with public sector uses of AI. A number of states have tackled this topic of how is the state government supposed to regulate its own use of AI? How do you ensure that your state agency implementing a health benefits program isn't using an algorithm that has discriminatory effect, for example? States have taken a number of approaches to this. Some have used executive orders to direct agencies to undertake certain steps. Others have passed legislation. And Montana is one of those states. Montana's House Bill 178, which passed earlier this year, takes the approach of prohibiting certain harmful uses of artificial intelligence by state agencies. For example, it prohibits state agencies from using artificial intelligence for, quote, cognitive behavior manipulation, classifying people based on protected classes like race or sex, or surveilling public places through things like facial recognition technology. It also requires that any state document that is generated by AI have a label disclosing the fact that it was created using generative AI. Other states have taken different approaches through legislation. Some, as Grace noted, have established task force to study the issue and make recommendations. Others, recognizing the role of artificial intelligence in making decisions about our lives, have required that states provide people notice that artificial intelligence was used to make those decisions and provide a right to appeal or a right to correct erroneous information. And still others have sought to establish audits and evaluations for the AI that they choose to procure.
So when it comes to algorithmic bias and discrimination, 2 states have really taken the lead, and that's Colorado and California. So in California, we're actually going to talk about a rulemaking process rather than a bill passing. So California is the only state with a state-level agency, government agency, dedicated specifically to privacy. And under the piece of legislation that created that agency, the agency is permitted to create rules on certain subjects. So in 2023, it began kind of the early informal stages of a rulemaking process on automated decision-making technology, risk assessments, cybersecurity audits, and a couple other subjects. And the rules are basically 120 pages of instructions about what people's rights are when companies are using a covered technology and how companies are expected to operationalize those rights. A lot of the rights are tied to when a company uses a, quote, automated decision-making technology, which the rules define, to make a decision about kind of access to a key life opportunity. So the provision or denial of financial lending services, housing, education, employment or independent contracting opportunities, compensation, and healthcare services. And in those cases where a company is using a covered technology to help in a specific way make one of those decisions, companies need to comply with certain requirements. So they'll need to give a consumer notice explaining the purpose of the technology and how the technology processes personal information, the type of output the system generates, and a few other pieces of information. In certain cases, they need to offer the right to opt out. After the decision is made, they need to enable consumers to access more information about how the decision was taken, including information about the logic of the technology, the outcome of the decision-making process, whether the technology was the sole factor, and a few other pieces of information. Companies will also have to do risk assessments when selling or sharing personal information, processing sensitive information, and when using ADMT to make a covered decision. And these rules have been on a long journey. As I said, they started in 2023. They are still not yet finalized. The agency has hosted lots of meetings where members of the public can give feedback. But by and large, those meetings have been attended not by normal members of the public, but by representatives of business and tech groups, along with civil society folks, including Kara and I and the ACLU of California. We've commented on the rules, provided feedback. These rules have been the subject of intense industry pushback and pressure, which has seemingly successfully, from the industry perspective, led the agency to narrow the rules. So one example of a tactic that was used, some business lobbying groups sent an email to each board member every single day for months about narrowing the rules. The other state that's done something pretty major on automated decision systems and bias is Colorado. Colorado passed a bill in 2024 that has a lot in common substantively with California's rules. It passed really swiftly in the final few weeks of the Colorado session, and Many civil society folks who care about civil rights and consumer protections felt it wasn't strong enough, but tech representatives felt it went too far and imposed too many requirements. The governor signed the law, and ever since it's been the subject of an absolutely massive lobbying effort to get it narrowed or repealed before it goes into effect in 2026. This bill, along with the California rules, is probably the single most consequential piece of US policy regarding bias in AI decision systems, and it's very likely part of the impetus for the moratorium effort we're seeing in Congress. I have far more thoughts about this bill and the process and the negotiations than I could possibly share today, so if you're interested in it, feel free to come find me after this presentation. And this is just kind of examples of some of the power politics at play with these processes. So in the California rulemaking process, for example, I mentioned the heavy industry pushback. One tactic that was used is a bunch of legislators sent a letter to the agency asking them to narrow their regulations, a somewhat unusual move. It was later reported that that letter had been ghostwritten by the California Chamber of Commerce, which is a major business lobbying group in California. And Newsom has also told the agency to walk back the rules. And in Colorado, Governor Polis is very friendly with the tech and venture capital community, and despite signing the law, he is now calling for it to be delayed, which is also what the tech lobbyists are pushing aggressively for, and I believe he's the only Democratic governor who's supported the moratorium. Yeah, so taking away his own state ability to pass policy, which is pretty unusual.
So we're going to shift gears from how states have addressed decision-making technology and its potential impact on people's civil rights and civil liberties to generative AI. And we're going to talk first about deepfakes, which of course is the ability of generative AI to produce audio, images, and video that are, to your average person, realistic and convincing. One of the big areas that folks have focused on is the use of deepfakes in elections. This was a concern that folks have commented on for some time, but gained increased salience in the lead up to the 2024 US presidential election, where a number of commentators were concerned that it would be the election of deepfakes. There was one fairly prominent incident in which telephonic deepfakes, voice deepfakes of President Joe Biden, who was of course running for re-election at the time, were used in phone calls, mass phone calls to a number of voters to discourage them from voting in an election. In the lead up to that election, some of the pieces of legislation that passed include one in Florida. And Florida's is fairly typical of what we've seen, but there are some variations among the laws. Florida's House Bill 919, which passed last year, prohibits any, quote, political advertisement, electioneering communication, or other miscellaneous advertisement of a political nature from being created with generative artificial intelligence. The bill also includes an exception if the communication includes a disclaimer that states it was created with artificial intelligence. So the net effect is that any deepfake about a politician would have to include that disclaimer. Approximately 25 other states, about half the states, have passed similar laws, and there are a number of variations, though, that tweak their scope and impact. Many of the states, for example, have extended their laws to any communication. So not limited to a political advertisement or electioneering communication, but any communication. Many states have also added express exemptions for satire or parody, or chosen to limit the effectiveness of their laws to 30, 60, or 90 days before an election. It's also worth noting that election is not just a general election, but also primary elections, as well as other elections like local elections or school board elections. And then finally, other states have added intent requirements, where the crime requires that the individual have an intent to injure a candidate's reputation or to influence an election. It's worth noting that this type of law is fairly new. There's litigation beginning to emerge in areas around these types of laws for the ways that they might impact free speech rights. And then, of course, the ability to comment on politicians, and especially on candidates running for election, is at the core of what the United States First Amendment seeks to protect. So we've seen the Court of Appeals in California enjoin California's deepfake laws. Litigation is unfolding in Minnesota, so this is definitely a space to watch. Another type of deepfake that has raised substantial concern across the country are sexual deepfakes. Deepfakes depicting an individual nude, primarily, of course, raising consent, are a concern when that's done without their consent. This is often referred to as non-consensual intimate imagery. Many states have passed laws over the past decade plus to address traditional photography that is disclosed about a person without their consent. And in response to the rise of deepfakes, many states have chosen to simply amend their existing NCII law to address deepfakes. And that's exactly what we saw happen in Virginia in 2019 when they passed House Bill 2678. Virginia's existing law already criminalized malicious distribution or sale of nude images of a person or images of that person revealing their genitals, the female breast, or buttocks. Concern emerged, however, whether or not that could easily be used to prosecute those who created deepfake images, and so the legislator expressly amended the statute to include deepfakes, which is defined as when a person's existing image is used to create, adapt, or modify another image with the intent to depict an actual person who is recognized as an actual person in the image. These bills have been widely passed, with approximately 40 states passing legislation to address deepfaked NCII. And in our last piece of legislation around generative AI, there's increasing efforts to legislate on chatbots. Chatbots have gained news on a number of fronts. For example, there's questions around how do existing theories of liability apply to chatbot agents. We saw in Canada, at least, that one court determined that Air Canada's use of an AI agent would create liability for the company just like a human could. So when that agent falsely told a person that they could access a certain discount, the court found that Air Canada had to be held responsible for the AI agent's false statement. Similarly, there's concerns emerging around the potential harms to children from chatbots, including addiction, emotional attachment to chatbots, or even suicidal ideation, arising most prominently in a recent lawsuit against a company called Character AI for the chatbot's supposed support and encouragement of a teenager who unfortunately committed suicide. The main legislation we've seen at this point addressing those harms has come in New York, where the budget package that was passed earlier this year has a couple of provisions addressing chatbots. First, an AI companion, which is a chatbot that specifically seeks to recreate familial or romantic relationships, has to include a disclaimer every 3 hours that it is not human. Similarly, an AI companion must include, quote, reasonable measures to detect and prevent self-harm by the users and provide resources such as the suicide hotline if it detects that the user might be engaging in suicidal ideation.
Okay, so after that great overview, I have the pleasure of walking you all through the more wonky aspects of state policy making. And we'll go first through the formal process of how state legislation actually works, including important factors like timing of legislative session and buy-in from other important political figures like the governor. And then additionally, what is often more impactful in the state legislative process than the formal legislative process is informal factors like lobbying and states' varying level of resource and staffing for their state legislatures. So with that in mind, the typical procedure for a state bill first starts with an important step of either a state lawmaker already being interested in emerging tech issues or through one of civil society groups' identification of someone in a specific state that is interested in introducing a strong bill on artificial intelligence or data privacy or a whole slew of other issues and working with them to actually get the bill introduced. So after that important first step that we often kind of glide right over but can be a big hurdle, then once a bill is introduced, it goes to the first chamber, which can be either side, either the Senate or the House, similar to what Cody was explaining at the federal level. And the first step there is for the bill to get a substantive hearing, which will consist of people from civil society and lobbying groups, tech companies. It could be regular constituents, although it's pretty rare to see that on tech bills. And importantly, it could be experts and people with technical expertise like you all coming in to explain the problem of harms that can arise from artificial intelligence or why a certain solution would be a good idea for a state to adopt. So after that hurdle is cleared, the bill goes then to the full chamber, so either the full Senate or the full House, who then votes whether or not to proceed with the legislation. And then a particularly difficult hurdle that we face in most states when trying to pass strong tech regulation is something called crossover, which basically is just a day by which legislation has to move to the other chamber, or otherwise it is dead for the year. So every state's is different, which is a unique problem in and of itself, because then we're trying to track 50 different crossover deadlines. But it's also a hurdle because of internal timing of state legislative sessions. It could only be a few weeks after their session has started, meaning that if it's not a priority bill, it might not be called up for a vote in time to meet crossover. So this is kind of the first major place that we run into issues and that a bill could die for the year. But assuming it meets crossover, we essentially have to do the exact same thing in the second chamber. So I'm not going to explain the whole process again, but it could get another substantive hearing. It definitely needs a committee vote in every state, and so assuming that goes well, it also needs a vote to proceed in the full chamber. And then one of two things can happen after that. If the second chamber passes a different version of the bill than the first chamber did, the bill then needs to go to something called a conference committee, which is made up of a couple lawmakers from each chamber who get together and essentially hammer out the details, try to come to a compromise from pieces of the bill from both the first and the second chamber to have something that they agree on, and then that is the law. But the easier path is that if the second chamber just votes to advance the bill that the first chamber has also voted on, then it goes to the governor's desk, when the governor can either sign the law, which then becomes the state's legislation on that topic. They can veto the law, meaning all that work kind of just goes away and the state has to start again next year. Or the governor can wait and do nothing, which has a different effect depending on what state you're in. Some states, if a governor lets a bill sit for a certain amount of time, it then becomes law without the governor's signature. Or in other cases, if a governor does not sign a bill, then it is dead. It essentially needs a signature to become law. So I know that was really a lot of detail and mostly stuff you guys don't need to worry about, but we wanted to talk about it mostly to illustrate exactly how many obstacles there are in this kind of process. It took me a long time even to walk you through that version, so now imagine that you need 50 or 100 state lawmakers from every state to buy in at each step for your law to get enacted. And that's only some of the constraints that state legislatures face when they're trying to regulate emerging tech issues. This slide has a map from the National Conference of State Legislatures on it that illustrates pretty well the differences between how different states operate in terms of their legislature. Most states, 40 out of 50 states, the lawmakers are considered part-time. So that means they have a whole nother job often. They're, like Grace said this already, but many of them are lawyers or small business owners or any job you can think of. They're also splitting their time between lawmaking for the state and doing a full-time job. You can see they often don't make very much money, and I just learned that New Mexico's state lawmakers are actually volunteers. They don't make any money at all. So this leaves lawmakers in a position where they often don't have very much subject matter expertise on the bills that they're voting on. They need to be generalists. Lawmakers need to be able to understand at a basic level the bills they're voting on a whole wide variety of topics, meaning that they are likely not going to understand the nuances of especially a complicated automated decision system bill or something in the realm of things that you all work on and study and could maybe, hopefully, help explain to them in a way that makes sense to someone who's not an expert. That's a large part of what we're doing in the States and what we're hoping you all might be interested in helping us with. One other important factor that constrains state legislatures' ability to pass strong laws is that they often have little or no support staff. They might not have a legislative council or someone to draft the legislation or anyone to take meetings with interested groups. So the legislator themselves might be trying to do all of that in addition to figuring out what the best policy is. So it's really essential to have good advisors and people they can turn to who are not interested in the result of a piece of legislation. So professors and experts in whatever they're trying to regulate are often those people for a lot of state legislators who they can trust.
Did you want to say something about buy-in from governors? Because we've had a real struggle with governors this year.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we have had a real struggle with governors this year. I mentioned this earlier, but the last step often is for a governor to sign or veto a piece of legislation. And particularly with tech bills, which I'll get a little bit more into in the lobbying slides in a little bit, but governors have been really susceptible recently and to a wide variety of lobbyists and have vetoed a lot of legislation in the tech world or threatened to veto it, meaning the state lawmakers pulled it before it got to their desk so that their governor would not veto their legislation. This is happening even in Democratic trifecta states, so in the places that are theoretically the most friendly to putting strong limits on the harms of ADMTs and other kinds of AI, we're still facing governors as a real obstacle to tech legislation.
Yeah, and the real politic of it is just like running for governor is very expensive. You need to raise a lot of money, and if you're raising a lot of money, you're probably relying on the business community somewhat. And so when they come to you and say, don't sign this law, we won't fund your next reelection campaign, I think that can carry a lot of sway.
Speaking of lobbying, it's really hard to overestimate the amount of time, money, effort, people power that these tech lobbying companies send to states that are considering regulating tech in a meaningful way. As you can see from the graph, the pure dollars that tech companies have put into state policymaking is skyrocketing, and these tech companies are developing strategies that are making them more effective at defeating these laws, unfortunately. One of the main strategies is to use trade associations. You rarely see Google or Facebook or Meta or Amazon going into a state house as Google to advocate on something. They fund groups that have good sounding names like the State Privacy and Security Coalition and other groups that sound like they're going to advocate for strong laws but are really funded by and taking their cues from big companies. And that's often hard for state lawmakers to see behind the curtain. So that's one of the main strategies we've seen big tech use. But another, which has come up more and more with the AI bills, is that they will hide behind local business or their local chambers of commerce and kind of try to convince those businesses that if a strong data privacy law is passed, it will, limit their ability to advertise and they won't be able to bring in new customers, or if they pass a strong law regulating the uses of AI, that they won't be able to hire people as effectively. Anything that they can do to scare small businesses that will cause the small businesses to go to their local lawmakers and say, I heard that this bill would be bad for my business, please don't vote for it, is really effective. It's the same kind of strategy we were just talking about with the governors that we're seeing in terms of lawmakers as well. And this, I really just want to pause here for a second and let you all just read some of the major headlines about tech lobbying in the states. These are mostly about data privacy, but we are seeing the exact same strategies being deployed in the fight over AI and automated decision system legislation. This really just shows how prevalent tech lobbying has become at the states and the kinds of strategies that lobbyists are employing. And if you're interested, I have lots of links and love to talk about this.
And if I'm not wrong, Kara, that first story is about Amazon writing a state bill and handing it to a Virginia lawmaker and then in Virginia passing. So the companies very much are writing the bills.
Yes, actually, on the next slide, I'll give you a nice little timeline of this. So the first 2019, the tech lobbyists from Amazon and Microsoft that Grace was just mentioning did write what they call a data privacy law, but really we say it's privacy in name only because it gives essentially no meaningful rights to consumers in those states to protect their privacy. But the lobbyists took it and handed it to a Virginia lawmaker who in 2021 managed to get that bill passed. And then other states began to follow, unfortunately. So in 2021 also, Colorado passed a data privacy bill based on the same framework. The next year, Utah and Connecticut passed bills also based on this industry written model. And then over the course of 2023 and 2024, 13 other states also passed this model. So you can see in 4 or 5 years how quickly a model comes out of an Amazon headquarters and into law in 17 states across the country. And the same thing is happening. We're seeing the early stages of it happening with automated decision system and algorithmic discrimination legislation. Workday, another, of course, big tech company, came out with a model bill on algorithmic discrimination, and versions of that have been replicated across the country in Connecticut, and the Colorado version is not the actual Workday model. It was beefed up a bit and has some strong consumer protections in it, but it's something that tech companies and Workday is trying to spread across the country the same way they did with data privacy. So I know all that sounded really scary, but we are here because the people in this room and at this conference in the FACT community can really help us avoid this problem with AI. Just like some state lawmakers learned their lesson and said we really messed up on social media, the civil society community and consumer protection advocates did too. We saw exactly what happened and we know better how to fight back this time, and we need your help. So there's 3 things that we're hoping you will take away from this talk, and they're all pretty simple. It's what can you do, how can you do it, and why should you? So the bottom line for you all is that we need you. We need technical experts like you to come into the state houses, to talk to lawmakers and share your perspectives and your knowledge with them so that they can craft stronger bills that will actually do something to protect consumers instead of having to rely on those big tech lobbyists for their advice. And so you have a lot to contribute. This is obviously from earlier this week. We just wanted to illustrate that we already do have the tools to shape this debate better than we are doing now. And you can use your issue area expertise, your practical knowledge about how the systems are built and how they work, to be a sounding board for state lawmakers who, like I said, are not experts. And so they are faced, for example, with a Google lobbyist coming in and saying, hey, could you change this bill so it says this instead, because the stronger regulation will make it so that our product doesn't work. And most of us are just advocates or lawyers, not technologists, and not people with enough expertise to be able to say, that's not true. The internet will not break if you regulate it, but you guys are. So and legislators really want is a disinterested voice to say that. And since researchers and technologists who do not work for those companies are able to have that kind of outside perspective, especially if you're coming from an institution or a university in their own state, they really do appreciate and respect that perspective. So much to contribute, and there are also lots of ways you can get involved, depending on what you're comfortable with. First, Cody's from the ACLU. What we do very first is we partner with local organizations. We never want to just swoop in and try to tell a state what's best for them, so we often try to find the local ACLU affiliate or any grassroots organization that is on the ground already working in that state and getting involved with them to make sure we don't step on any toes and we do things the best way that we possibly can for that state. So you could do that too. You could partner with any local organizations that are in your state, but you can do other things that might be a lighter lift as well if you are interested in perhaps testifying in those hearings that I was mentioning earlier. That's an early stage of the state legislative process, so that's one of the first things that will happen is, and that was the video of Suresh also, was from a state hearing where you could do something similar and explain the problem and how solutions are possible. And then another important avenue is talking to the press about these problems or why a certain law would or would not solve some harms like bias or inaccuracy in these systems. That is a really important role because the general public also needs to buy in and understand these problems a little bit for them to be motivated to call their lawmakers and encourage them to act on this issue. And the best way for you to learn about these opportunities is to connect with organizations like ours or like the local organizations that are on the ground in your states already working on legislation. Or if you're extra motivated, you can also do the bill tracking and outreach yourself. There are often one or two legislators who are interested in tech issues in every state that tend to run both the data privacy bills and the AI bills. So you are, of course, more than welcome, and they would love it if you connected with them, but we can also help make those connections. And then I hope you guys already have an answer to this from this presentation, but just to drive it home, why should you bother? State lawmakers in general want to do the right thing and don't have the resources. As we've explained, they are very under-resourced and run into lots of obstacles when they're trying to pass legislation on tech issues. So they are extremely likely to seek external advice, and if there's no civil society or experts who are interested in making sure tech is accountable and fair and transparent, they are going to listen to lobbyists from big tech companies. They will be around. They seem to have endless people, endless money, endless time to talk to these state lawmakers and push their perspective. So the best way to get involved and stop the push of weak legislation is to be there and be willing to talk to them and share your perspectives. So thank you very much. Let us know if you have questions. We can take them now, and also feel free to connect with all of us after as well.
Do you guys? Do you guys have time?
With 5 minutes.
Okay. Yes, so we would love your question. I see someone's ready with a question, and if you have a question, if you can just come up to the mics in the center aisle, that would be great.
Okay, hello, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate the whole presentation, and I'm sure everyone else does too. I wanted to ask you specifically about the number, like the estimate of 700 bills from last year. So you hear like these numbers a lot. I think I've heard a number as high as 2,000 from some of the pro-moratorium people, because 2,000 is like a scary number of bills, I guess. But you know, you seem to talk about like quite a bit fewer bills. You know, in one of the subsequent slides when you're listing like this many dozen on this topic and this many dozen on this topic, and there seems to be kind of a big gap. You know, like what are these like other maybe 600 bills that are kind of out of the scope of what we were talking about today? And really I'm just kind of asking about a question about like what this number 700 really means and where it comes from. Like, does it come from like keyword searches and any bill that mentions AI is counted? Or is there some sort of more methodical way that this number has been like created? So the right number to mention is probably different in different contexts. And I'm kind of wondering what the 700 specifically means.
Yeah, you've touched on exactly a core issue, and you're exactly right that the really big inflated numbers are often used to try to purport to say, we are being crushed, we being Microsoft and OpenAI, by this patchwork of laws that we can't possibly comply with, even though national companies have complied with 50 state laws since 1789. And so that number is important because it's being used as a political talking point. Marissa? I'm calling on my colleague, Marissa Gerchik, here in the audience. Can I talk about the thing, or is that? Okay. So, and the question that you dropped on is really important. Is how do we get to the bottom of that? And it's something that us mere lawyers and policy councils have tried to examine, and it's overwhelming. The number of state laws is difficult. It is a fair number, especially across jurisdictions, and especially because of the fact that not all jurisdictions make their bills accessible, especially from like a machine-readable standpoint that can be easily processed. So my friends in the data and analytics team at the ACLU and their tech team are working very hard to, maybe somewhat ironically, use natural language processing to get to that very question and analyze how many bills are there regarding AI generally, and what categories do they fall into, and how substantive are they? That project's in fairly early days. They're working very hard on it, but getting to that point of saying, does this reference AI a one-off? Is it tweaking some internal governmental system, or is it the Colorado AI Act? Those are very different questions, and it's something we want to get to the bottom of, because right now our friends in the Chamber of Commerce are throwing around 1,000 bills every year with no footnote, and it's scary for folks.
Oh, there are also a lot of other genres of bills that mention the term artificial intelligence. So the 700 number came from a business group that's trying to do this tally, so not from us, Business Software Alliance. So I don't know what their methodology was. But there's also bills that do things just like define the term artificial intelligence for future use. So there's a lot of bills that maybe don't do super substantive stuff.
Hi, thanks so much. That was a really, really useful tutorial. So I want to ask about your thousand or brother question. So I feel like when we talk about like privacy and privacy bills, I feel like it's very clear like tension between people and big tech. But something I've noticed in the past year with more like generative AI is that whenever I talk to people who are not in computer science, but they're very well read, very well informed, they really care about people's rights. Whenever we talk about AI regulation, everyone's really, really, really focused on super intelligence and bioweapons and nuclear risks and all these that open-end companies have been really pushing for what they understand for AI regulation. And every time LinkedIn uses an algorithm, Instagram uses, and I feel like people are really not aware of how much it's around. And so I think it's a different kind of tension in the sense of it's not that we're fighting over privacy, it's more I feel like a lot of these issues just no one is really talking about them. And I don't know if you've felt this tension and if you have any advice on what to do about this, because it's something that I just keep noticing, and I'm not, I'm always there's more issues to AI regulation beyond super intelligence, but I know how to go about it.
Yeah, so this is definitely, you've hit on one of the biggest issues, I'd say, in algorithmic discrimination bills that I have with the way that we're approaching state policy. We call them AI bills, even though they're only narrowly defined to target these systems that make important decisions about people's lives in specific contexts. So it's really only if a system is helping you make a hiring decision or a decision about insurance, some high stakes thing, and yet it's being classified as AI policy, AI legislation. And so it then brings in a whole extra layer of people who are scared because they're like, oh, you're gonna regulate all AI, it's going to stifle innovation. And I think it gives that argument more credence when we are not more careful about how we name things. But one of the core fights is about these definitions and how many different kinds of technology are going to be included in each regulation. That was my first reaction. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, the other thing I'll say is I think it's actually something that state legislators have been relatively good at. You would definitely see, working on bills that address more discrete, everyday harms. There have definitely been some bills that are more focused on existential risk, but those aren't the majority of bills. The other interesting dynamic we've seen is that, yes, tech founders, especially 2 years ago, were talking a lot about being concerned about superintelligence and a lot about concerns about how AI could do trading and take the stock market or hack the grid. And then there have been some bills that have attempted to address specifically the societal level risks, and they don't like them. They lobby against them. So they're not very internally consistent on their concern about those risks.
And it's unfortunately made regulating and legislating in some of those less sexy topics about AI that's determining, how much of a mortgage you're offered, a little bit more difficult because politicians have to run for election every 2 years, and the question of whether or not open model weights is going to lead to a nuclear bomb is much more attractive to them, even though the risk might be that much more remote. So often there's chasing of the shiny thing that's in the headlines as opposed to some of these longer, slower simmering concerns.
And that's also another place that people in this community can really plug in and make clear, even in a 2-minute testimony, that yes, this is an AI bill, but it's not regulating some of those kinds of AI that regular people and the tech companies are most excited about. Instead, it's addressing the system about the mortgage that Cody just said that has existed for a decade now and is causing real harms. So that's something we work hard to do, is differentiate, but it doesn't always land as well when we're not tech experts.
Are we at time?
Yeah. We're running up against the clock, we know, so we're happy to stay, but no one feel like we have
But
kidnapped the room.
let's get Sorrel's question.
It's not a question. I'm going to quickly say the thing that you all didn't, which is that if there's folks in the room who want to get involved in this and are based in the U.S., please go up and talk to them.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Sorrel's also been great at getting involved, so I'm sure she would be happy to direct you to us.